a brief introduction, and we're going to get the program underway. I instigated this because I was fascinated by the fact that we have two of our scholars who published their first books, and they're very different books, but they're both security experts. Larry did his PhD at UCLA and published his first book with Stanford University Press. Jarrod also did his PhD at USC, so both California PhD.
It's amazing we talk to each other, really.
Yeah.
And but Jarrod's PhD advisor praises Larry's book, I think, on the back jacket. So I was really curious. I've read bits and pieces of both of their books, but I haven't had a chance to read them in their entirety. But I'm intrigued by the fact that these young scholars are using ideas very seriously and trying to get at how ideas matter in world politics. And I said I was selfishly interested because when I was a PhD student and I wanted to talk about ideas and values, it was all, I had a hard time doing that. We were telling stories or trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. That's the response I got from my committee members. But I have an abiding interest, and I think we all do, and so I'm really curious to understand a little bit about their research process and how they came to write such important books that are getting a lot of traction and helping to continue to put the Nunn School on the map. So I thank both of them for their hard work and congratulate them on their first book publications, and we're just going to get the program underway. Each author will talk about their book for 20 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes remaining for the Q&A. I have to leave a little bit before the program concludes, so I've asked my colleague Alistair to manage the Q&A if it gets out of hand, to make sure things stay fair and balanced between the two authors. So without further ado, Larry, I think you're going to start. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vicki, for the warm introduction and for organizing this as well. And I think actually, I'll start by saying a little bit about motivations for this in terms of on this theme of ideas, and part of it had to do with throughout the course of field work, kind of playing around with various topics for this project. And one of the actually initial topics that brought me to this was looking at nuclear proliferation issues in the Middle East, and it brought me in a different direction. And what it was in coming across people I was interviewing in Egypt and talking about threat perception, that I kept coming across people talking about not necessarily balance of power and those really hard military terms, but more about things that may affect threat perception of images and ideas and ideologies. And I became more fascinated about basically delving into this a little bit more and how I could make it work. So this really, and it also kind of really just spoke to me in a different way. So I guess with that type of introduction of where this comes from, the other thing that I want to do is in doing this also, it's also difficult but also fascinating at the same time to look at this in a way of also trying to read and look at the news and figure out where does it lie, am I right, or and in what ways it may be right or kind of missing things. So I'll try to bring in, and for the next few minutes, things in current events and how the book relates to this. So last week, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain broke off diplomatic relations with Qatar. And many claim that this was about country foreign policy and support for the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as other affiliated organizations in various conflicts in the Middle East, particularly, of course, in Egypt and the Egyptian government. This, for a large part, I think a lot of this story is correct, but I think to some extent it misses what's kind of going on, and this is what I'm talking about, the idea of ideas. And I'll go into the subject a little bit more once I talk and kind of go through the overview of the book and then kind of return to this a little bit. So you might ask the question to a casual observer, why would Saudi Arabia, this, as many people know kind of from the outside, a country that prides itself on its Islamic heritage and really tries to push this type of agenda, be afraid of an organization that is trying to push for Islamic values in society, in its own societies or societies across the region? That might be the more general question. And in addition to that, this is also a country that had supported and given asylum to many Muslim Brotherhood leaders in the 1950s and 60s when they were being exiled and cracked down and basically repressed and jailed, in particular in Egypt. So it kind of looks at this raises a couple questions of what's been going on in international politics. Secondly, at the level of international politics, we can ask why are these states basically working so hard and breaking up diplomatic relations over we're talking about a non-state group, a tiny little non-state group. We know that states get up in arms, but if we want to try to take a step back to the level of international politics, we're talking about these non-state groups that are formed around ideas and ideologies. And then even going back to the state level, we have Qatar, which is a very small state population-wise and geographically, and compared to Saudi Arabia militarily as well. Why are these kind of states really up in arms about them and in a sense kind of balancing against them? Well, looking a little bit further, the regional responses since the Arab uprisings also raise similar questions about the roles of ideas, threats, and power in international politics. And a lot of the conservative monarchies reacted in this way using their vast resources, economic and ideational, and in some cases militarily, preventing revolutionary contagion and in part the spread of ideas that pushed for political reform. So these uprisings also, as we saw, overthrew highly entrenched regimes backed by very strong coercive apparatuses and backed by the world's strongest superpower in the United States. It really raises a number of questions about, not saying questioning entirely, but the role of military power. And then after Islamists came to power in Egypt in 2012, Saudi Arabia and the UAE mobilized a number of these resources at home and abroad against the Muslim Brotherhood, these various campaigns that we see, as I mentioned today. These were massive disinformation campaigns and accompanied by repressive measures in different ways. And Riyadh and Abu Dhabi quickly welcomed the return, or we'll say Egypt's military overthrow of the Islamist-led Morsi regime, and they pledged billions in aid. You see this kind of definitely shoot up. The question this book then tries to get at is can ideas threaten? Because we're asking questions about, are these states, is this really about military threats, and if so, in what way? There are claims about the terrorism and overthrowing the regime, but are these really against traditional types of military threats we deal with at the state-to-state level? And then we're also in the book looking at basically how have states reacted to these threats. So I say basically, I argue that ideas do matter, and the story of Islamist regimes throughout kind of the last 30, 40, 50 years, 30 plus years, provides the necessary insight. And as the book describes, it looks primarily at cases at almost in a sense it's 4 dyads, and they are cases of Arab states in response to the rise of Islamist regimes that come to power. And it looks at questions of basically when military power is actually in reverse in terms of military power isn't threatening, and in cases when it may be in decline, yet the threat increases. So it looks at these cases of Egypt and Saudi Arabia's responses to the rise of Islamist regimes in Iran and the Sudan. Iran in 1979, the Sudan in 1989. Just after the Iranian Revolution, Iran's military power declined in part because it was in the middle of a revolution, and yet the threat throughout the 1980s, the ideological threat increases, leads to a number of behaviors that are driven by this. The same thing in 1989 with Sudan, extremely weak state, militarily torn by civil war. It launches this kind of projection of an ideological power, and at a certain point, there's extremely tense relations between Egypt and Sudan, and also there's tense relations, and I would argue not just about Iraq or about Osama bin Laden, but in other ways between Sudan and Saudi Arabia as well. These were all former allies. So the argument that I have is in looking at basically can ideas threaten and why or how, looks at the idea that there is the transnational ideologies may not be the most salient threat. There may be more serious national security threat in the form of ideas. This argument has 2 main components. Ideology or ideational power triggers threat perception and affects state policy because it can undermine domestic stability in other states and basically affect the regime survival of another state. That's really the essence. And the socio-political logic that drives this is the projection of domestic ideology through culturally resonant symbols. And what this is doing or does, it could alter the commonly held beliefs about legitimacy in the target regime society. And then, of course, facilitate social unrest. This is what these states are scared of. Second, how states react. States engage in ideational balancing, I argue. And this term is a non-military response that aims to mitigate the state's political symbolic power through resource mobilization and counter-framing. So there's a number of different tactics that I go into with regard to the counter-framing exercises that are involved in terms of, just to give an example of denial and defense and counterattack and neutralization. Some of them might be undermining the credibility of the source that's actually projecting this message or image of saying, you're not Muslim enough, you're not Arab enough in this way, and saying, look what types of policies you have. And these types of battles that go on at the official level, and as well as kind of really this image projection that's taking place. And then, of course, it does use the aspect of resources, but the resources that I focus on are the types that really contribute to a production or spread or promotion of ideas or ideology. So it might be investing in state institutions that promote an image that may be, in a sense, a defensive type of thing. It may be explaining, oh, you're attacking us for not being Islamic enough. We are the true, we are really the representatives of what true Islam is in that way. And it could be more of also at the level of investing in these types of state apparatuses that deal in ideology of reprojecting or, say, countering in a certain phase of these types of attacks. So the other key component that I'll say here is that I mentioned about projection, because projection is important. It's not just that a state all of a sudden becomes this ideological type of state or an ideational state, but it has to actually project this power. And I look at it also in terms of, and states do this in times of societal crises. Lastly, the other term that I introduce here in the book is what I call an ideational security dilemma. And this is what I say a lot of times drives this instability. It gathers or borrows from a lot of the traditional definitions of security dilemma, but looks really in this ideational realm and tries to separate the two. So returning back to what I initially discussed in terms of the current events, one of the things that in the conclusion of the book that I discuss, and it's really an ongoing type of policy, and if you look in terms of today's politics, balancing the brotherhood is what I might call in the post-Arab Spring environment of this big pushback, or we'll say trying to basically balance against this threat during the really tumultuous time of the Arab Spring or uprising, however you want to call it. This is what I say is part and parcel of this ideational balancing that I argue in the book. But today, I might even say that it could appear one step further, and with recent events, it's really hard to know when you're commenting on Middle East politics, especially trying to make these grand theories about something that's happening from one week to the next. But at the same time, if you were to do that type of thing, you may see these kinds of blips. And this is really a question: what would be happening now is really pushing or rolling back. At least this is what, say, for instance, the Saudis might suspect, that this is a window of opportunity to push the Muslim Brotherhood back. You've got the Muslim Brotherhood being outlawed, and it's outlawed in various states, and this seems to be kind of capturing this type of momentum. So what I guess and what I said at the outset was that I think some of it might capture the right story, but what it might miss is, in a sense, that it's not just about this diplomatic game. What I try to look at, what I'd argue, is it's important to look at what's driving these threat perceptions in this way. And the root of this, as I say, this kind of the fear of ideas, the fear of ideology, and what role this type of projection might be able to play in terms of affecting other states' threat perceptions and their national security.
Thanks, Vicky, for putting this together, and thanks, Larry, for coming along on this. So you can see this is my book here. It came out at the end of last year. How did I get to it? Well, I came to IR from a sort of roundabout background. I came to it through the natural sciences. I was an astrophysics undergrad at the University of Colorado, and I added political science quite late. So in thinking about international relations, the thing that strikes me are the differences between social systems and natural systems. And the ways, and one of the pivotal differences between natural systems and social systems is the role of human thought, of human ideas, and how we make sense of the world. And that's really driven most, if not all, of my research, is how do we make sense of the world? What meaning do we give to the world? And this is not at the subjective level, this is at the intersubjective level, right? How are these meanings and meaning structures shared across individuals that shape general patterns of behavior and general understandings of the world? So this book is an effort to try to understand how shared meaning shapes understandings of the world by looking at the ways in which a specific set of domestic political arrangements, which we call democracy, shapes how societies and states understand their threat environments in the international system. And the argument that I make is that there is, within democracies, an identity that forms through the practice of democracy, right? Every day we go out and we recreate, in a sense, what a democratic system is by observing specific sets of rules, norms, and expectations about how we will deal with each other, specifically in the context of conflict resolution. So I would argue, and I do argue in the book, that democracy is primarily a system of conflict resolution. That is how we work out distributions of resources, access to resources, access to privilege, etc., right? Democracy provides a basis for how we do that. And in observing that, we form an identity, right? We ourselves as Democrats, not big D, as in versus Republicans, but small d. And this idea shapes our interactions with each other on an everyday basis, right? So if you disagree with me, if you're a student and you disagree with me about the grade, there are certain procedures, certain practices that you need to follow if you're going to be a good student, right? Which is part of being part of existing within the broader democracy, right? If you're a student in a different country, an authoritarian country, you might resort to corruption or bribery, you might resort to physical threats, but here in this democracy, you would resort to following the rule of law. So you would first go to the chair, and then you would go to the dean, and then you would go to the provost or whatever, right? And in doing so, you are enacting an identity, an understanding of yourself and an understanding of the world through the certain frame of ideas and norms. So my argument is that shared democratic identity across the public has an important role in shaping how we understand international threats. Specifically, external states that are democracies cannot be understood to be threats, or it's very difficult to portray them as threats because they're understood to be operating by the same rules that we operate by, that resolve conflicts in our domestic context. And conversely, if the external state is an authoritarian state, they are by definition operating by a different set of conflict resolution rules. They are operating with a different set of ideas about how the world works, how conflict should be resolved, and they could quite plausibly use force. And the public then can accept a claim that the external state might use force. So that's the broad brushstroke argument for the book. So I'll get into a little bit of the theoretical weeds, since a lot of you are here, have some sense as to what's going on in the discipline of international relations and specifically IR theory. So the book brings together a couple different strands of theory. It's at the basis, it's predicated on securitization theory, which was developed in Copenhagen by Ole Wever, Barry Buzan, and they argue that security threats are not natural, objective states of affairs, but rather the product of shared ideas, right? In this case, the product of a speech act. A securitizing actor makes a claim that something external poses an existential threat to something of value, right? So the state, our individual livelihoods, our individual welfare, these are all things existentially valuable. If they go away, the social system is altered irrevocably, or our individual systems are irrevocably altered. Just because they make this claim of a security threat doesn't mean it's successful. They make it with respect to a particular audience, and that audience assesses whether the security claim has validity, legitimacy, and they do so on two grounds. First, is the threat existential? And second, is what's being threatened existentially valuable? And if one or the other of these, or both, are not accepted by the audience, then the securitizing move fails. And what are the ramifications for that? Well, the Copenhagen School was formulated in the context of a modern European democracy. So their vision, their idea of what security looks like is embodied in the transition between what they call normal politics and security politics. So normal politics is what we recognize every day in democracy in terms of normal standard operating procedures, normal procedures of conflict resolution. So things like rule of law, debate, diffusion of power, political power, standard operating procedures, etc. And security politics are comprised of, in many ways, the opposite of these things. So Ole Wever and Barry Buzan got their idea of security politics from the philosophical work of Carl Schmitt, who provided some of the philosophical foundations for the Nazi regime in Germany in the 1930s. And under security politics, you have power centralization. You have a diminution of debate. You have extraordinary measures that are taken. And the reason for these extraordinary measures is because the referent object, the existentially valued thing, is existentially threatened. You don't have time to debate what to do about it. You have to act, and you have to act quickly. There's some interesting ramifications that come out of this. Security is understood by the Copenhagen School to be corrosive to democracy, and you can understand why, because the state of security or security politics are in many ways the antithesis of democratic politics. Adding to this is what I draw on some work by social psychologists called social identity theory. And the reason I do that is because securitization theory provides a good starting point for understanding security outcomes in the international system, but it doesn't provide an entire theory. It's not intended to. And one of the things that securitization theory leaves out are the things, the social, political, cultural context that empowers security, right? So if you were to choose sort of an absurd example, but if you were to go into a predominantly Muslim country and argue that Christmas is being threatened, they're not likely to care, right? Because they don't see the referent object as existentially valuable. That's what I'm talking about, the social, political, cultural context that gives security its power. Securitizing moves their power. So one of the ways that I try to get at this is by thinking about identity. But you can't just sort of wave your hands and say identity and then move on. You need to provide some theoretical foundation for it. And I turn to social psychology and social identity theory to provide that foundation. The social identity theory argues from a very strong empirical basis that humans think about the world in identity terms. How we think about ourselves, what groups we consider ourselves to be members of, fundamentally reshapes how we understand the world. Now, we're all obviously members of different identity groups. We're professors and students and members of Georgia Tech. We're members of where we got our undergraduate or graduate degrees. So it's interesting that Larry has blue on and I have red on, Larry being from UCLA, me being from USC in terms of our graduate, training. And I bring that up simply to point out that we have multiple identities. And which identities are activated at any specific time has a significant impact on how we understand the world. So if our religious identity is activated, we have a very different understanding of conflicts, what is existentially valuable, than we do if our political identity is activated, or if our professional identity is activated. You can see where that's going. Part of this is for emotional reasons. So although we as scholars don't like to acknowledge it, humans are, in some sense, emotional creatures. And we get emotional fulfillment from success of our identity groups. We see this in sports all the time. I don't know about you guys, but when USC is successful on the football field, I feel pretty good. And it's not because I've done anything, right? It's because the exemplar of my in-group has been successful, and therefore my in-group has been successful. Part of this is, conversely, because of rational reasons, access to resources. So groups tend to privilege other members of their groups in terms of access to resources, in terms of professional opportunities, etc. But a third reason is that we as humans have limited cognitive capability. We don't re-understand the world every day. We don't re-understand our social interactions every day. We rely on heuristics, on intellectual, mental shortcuts to make sense of our world. And identity is a powerful one of these. So once an identity is activated, you come to understand how, not only how relations are, but how relations should be between yourself and other members of the in-group, as well as between yourself and other members of the out-group. So you can see that this gives a very strong theoretical and empirical grounding to thinking about the role of identity in international security. And it does so by informing us that identity shapes how we understand conflict. So we can hypothesize that democratic identity has an effect, and we can look to social identity theory to see that these effects, at least on the micro scale, do play out in laboratories. But what social identity theory doesn't do is it doesn't provide a very good grasp of how these effects play out on the macro scale. Unfortunately, identity is not something we can observe. It's not a material factor like money or guns. It's difficult to see the causal impact of identity. The way I get around that is I take a look at the discourses. So how are political actors, securitizing actors, attempting to frame the situation? How are they attempting to activate specific identities such that they can make a compelling case for the presence of security, or conversely, the absence of a security threat? And in the book, I look at 4 cases revolving around U.S. relations with rising powers, India and China. India is commonly accepted in the United States to be a democracy, and China is commonly accepted in the United States to be not a democracy. Now you see one of the hedges that one of the fudges that I'm making in the book, which is that I'm not exactly examining where these understandings come from. That's a complex story. It has to do with media, has to do with education systems. That's a different book to be written. I just posit, I think plausibly so, that these countries are commonly understood to be these things. Now, whether these things matter depends on how political actors understand the social, political, and cultural context they're operating within, and how they attempt to activate identities in service to their political arguments. And I find across the cases that political actors do access democratic identity in their efforts to make security claims. So with respect to India, political actors who want to construct India as a threat emphasize the undemocratic nature of India's actions. So in the case of 1971, the Bangladesh War, which is one of my cases, political actors would try to emphasize that India was taking advantage of a smaller state, a predatory practice, not a terribly democratic practice, right? And in the case of democracies, people who want to construct the external democracy as a non-threat will emphasize the democratic credentials of the external democracy. Coming back to the 1971 case, Nixon and Kissinger, who were in office at that time, desperately wanted to construct India as a threat, and they were unable to do so because they were opposed by strong forces within Congress and within the popular media that were holding that India is a democracy and therefore should be a natural ally rather than an enemy. Conversely, with respect to China, those who seek to securitize China emphasize its non-democratic aspects. And those who seek to desecuritize China or present China as a non-threat have an interesting problem, right? Because nobody really thinks that China's a democracy. So what they do is they either try to ignore the problem, or, in the cases that I looked at, they borrow from future Chinese democracy, which I think is a very interesting rhetorical move. So in both of my cases occur after the Clinton administration tried to establish this idea of engagement, right? That engaging with China would result in future Chinese democracy. And this was after the failure to link China's most favored nation trading status with its human rights record. Clinton initially tried to do that. China said bugger off. And Clinton was left with a difficult decision, either invoke or reject China's most favored nation trading status, which would result in significant economic damages to the United States, or back down. And the way he backed down is he said, well, China's not a democracy yet, they don't have human rights yet, but they will in the future if we just continue to engage with them. So he inadvertently gave policymakers a tool for desecuritizing China by allowing them to borrow from future Chinese democracy. Clinton used this very same tool later in the 95-96 Taiwan Straits crisis. And then, interestingly enough, George W. Bush, despite his ABC, anything but Clinton approach to everything, it seems, also borrowed from engagement as a means of desecuritizing China during the 2001 EP3 incident. So throughout these cases, what you see is contestation over identity, contestation of the idea of the external other, relying on ideas about who we are and how we should act based on our identity as Democrats, small d. So I think I'll leave it there.
Wow, thank you both. Keeping to your strict time limit. So the floor is open for the first question. Go ahead.
I want to ask, thank you, both of you, IR theory questions, since you're talking about the importance of ideas. And what I want to ask you is your view of the famous distinction in IR theory between the ideational and the material. I guess I would like to know your opinion about how meaningful the distinction is on the basis of your research in these books. Are you saying ideas all the way down, or are you saying something else? And if you're saying something else, does the material have really any independent existence in international relations? Can we really talk about it as a meaningful category on its own, or it doesn't really have any independent existence? Everything depends on what ideas be attached to anything material.
Where do you go?
You can go first. It's a good question.
It is a good question.
Save her for the qual.
Yeah.
Yeah, we already did those.
Any PhD students in here? I'm not willing to sort of throw out materiality altogether. So one of the things that the Copenhagen School emphasizes is that, interestingly enough, I gave a talk on this at LSE, and Barry Buzan was in the room, which was really nervous, and the phone on the wall kept ringing, so I joked that it was Ole Waver calling. So the Copenhagen School argues that one of the facilitating conditions that enables securitizing moves is that the thing that is being claimed to be threatening is commonly accepted to be threatening. So there you have an interesting juncture between ideas and materiality, right? And when I do this talk and I have my PowerPoint, I make the case that tanks are generally seen as threatening, whereas bunny rabbits are generally not seen as threatening, right? And part of that is ideational, but part of that is just down to the materiality of the thing. Outside, I guess farmers might see bunny rabbits as threatening, but most of us don't, right? Unless you're Monty Python and you're being attacked by a killer rabbit. So materiality, there is a sort of core materiality that I think it's difficult to sort of ideationalize away. But I think that core is even so, even coming back to this case of tanks generally being seen as threatening. Tanks painted in UN blue are very different than tanks painted in a Russian camouflage scheme if you're in Ukraine, right? So even the tank, the idea of the tank varies depending on the tank as a threat varies depending on the ideas that cloak it. So there is a sort of nugget of materiality, but I would argue most of what we think about in terms of materiality are actually our ideas about what materiality means.
Thank you, Jarrod, for going first. But so I was trying to think of how to best integrate the answer and in terms of what I did, because it's something that I struggled with throughout this project. And in part, I guess to give some background, I try to say this, but didn't want to say that I was throwing away by any means these material approaches, because I still find the arguments to be quite compelling. What I was trying to, I think initially even starting off with this was saying when and how or why when do ideas matter more, rather than saying, okay, then they don't. But here's some cases where that might not be driving the situation to the threat. Not saying anything universal that it's all that is all about ideas, and that there is really there are a lot of really kind of rough areas that are really gray areas that you're going to encounter, and I think that's I think if something were, I think it would be, we'd be out of a job if everything were so clear cut in that way. But there are also cases, I can say that the way I kind of also blended it in the way of material aspects of things, of things. I'm not talking, say, money or finance or economics, or where do you do with that? And the way that I use, and I described in the introduction of that, so these types of material resources using for, in a sense, the sole purpose of really promoting ideas or images. And so somebody might say that's somewhat, that is material or economic. That has to do with maybe a state's economic power may give it some type of an advantage in that way. And I would say, yeah, to some extent it is, but what I'm saying is the end result, or what the war is really about, it's about this production of, or production of promotion of ideas and image. And that's really the focus. And that's what really becomes, at the level of international politics in this way, that's what becomes the important aspect of power here, where it's driving. And again, it's not saying that what I also try to do in this is dealing with the Iranian nuclear question, because it's undeniable that that this would shift the balance of power in a significant way when it comes to the military. But what I try to look at in certain ways of how it would also enhance the ideational power in this way, of aspects of its prestige and certain things of its ability to project this type of power. So. That's it more on the how you kind of describe it in this way of from the empirical aspect of contributing to this type of really difficult question that I think you asked.
If I could, so while Larry was talking, I was thinking about this still, and so I would just add that my argument is not such that studies that are based on sort of material variables are wrong. Not at all, right? So you can imagine situations where specific ideas about the materiality that those variables code for lines up very well with the study, right? So we think about this maybe in realist terms, right? That military power has certain outcomes. Well, I think if for the Chinese leadership, that makes a lot of sense because they think about the world in those terms, right? So the materiality means that to them. So it's less about right and wrong and more about, to my mind, actually, I think there's a parallel between Einsteinian and Newtonian physics and ideas and materiality, right? So Newtonian physics is accurate under a specific set of circumstances, parameter conditions. Einsteinian physics encompasses that and more, right? So for most of the things that we deal with in everyday life, Newtonian physics works just fine. But if you want to understand the broader universe, you have to understand the Einsteinian physics which collapse down to Newtonian under those parameters. My argument would be that sort of conventional materialist interpretations of IR work under certain parameters, right? But those parameters are relatively narrow compared to the universe of things that happen in the international system. And so if we really want to understand the international system, we understand the ideational forces that are at play, which can collapse down into those more traditional materialist interpretation under certain circumstances.
But then, if I may follow up, does that mean that the ideational factors always precede the material capability? If you try to sketch them, right, you try to figure out, so are they both independent variables? Because if I think about, for instance, shared historical experiences, condition your interests, condition your identity, and so on. It seems that would have to go prior to discussions of these material capabilities, at least in various scenarios we could see.
Yeah. So it's in some ways, I'm sort of thinking about this in the context of nuclear weapons, and which is a nice sort of exemplar because we have a very clear, they didn't exist before a certain point and now they do exist, and so they're relatively novel material objects. But certainly the understanding of nuclear weapons when they were first used was derived in some sense from historical experience, right? So the ideas about trying to make sense of what these things were But then the two things have actually co-evolved over time. So the idea of nuclear weapons have co-evolved as the weapons themselves have changed in their materiality.
That's why it's a PhD
Yeah,
qualifying.
yeah, yeah,
Be
yeah.
forewarned, we have to use
Yeah.
this.
Even so, I mean, you look at how the Japanese understand nuclear weapons and how Americans understand nuclear weapons and how Europeans understand nuclear weapons, and they're very different, even though the materiality of the things is the same. So that comes out of their experience, right? Americans see these things as saviors of their security. Japanese see these things as the ultimate victimizers. And Europeans see them as sort of, well, in a little bit, they're somewhere in the middle, right? But they're certainly ambivalent towards nuclear weapons in large parts of Western Europe, outside of France and the UK. And even in the UK, you see a lot of ambivalence. So even the idea of nuclear weapons as a guarantor of security varies depending on the political culture and context, social context you're operating in.
That seems to indicate it would proceed.
It does seem to indicate it would proceed. I'm hesitant to sort of make a declarative statement because then somebody come back to me and say you're wrong.
I wouldn't either if I were you.
I was going to actually add one other thing going on before we get away from that, kind of to Mickey's question in a different way. I thought about is that one of the things that I forgot at the very beginning is I was mentioning actually in part the title of the book is the, in a sense I skipped the punchline, but Islam in the Balance, Ideational Threats in Arab Politics. So it's basically saying what this is, this idea of in this balance, and a different type of balance and balance of power, and why or how it matters in other ways. And I think this is, we kind of say, what are these types of effects, or how it might matter for, say, what are the policy implications of misperceiving certain threats, or what they may actually be, or this type of thing, is in part, and this might actually have to do with U.S. foreign policy in a lot of ways, is understanding certain types of threats as military when they're in fact they may be ideational, and this is where kind of it, I'll say, bringing it back, is where or why it matters and why ideas in this way matter, because you could be constructing various policies based on threats that are based on responses and reactions that aren't driven by the proper threats, and basically the types of policies. It may be arming, it may be arming allies when their threats are internal and aren't necessarily from other external armies, and this is kind of where a lot of this comes from, or where it doesn't directly answer what Mickey was asking here, but in a certain sense of here's how you see actually how it plays out if these distinctions aren't quite made. Sorry, Jen.
Oh no, I just had a question about sort of like I guess, well, it's for Jarrod, right? Larry might be able to speak to this as well. So, you sort of frame, I haven't read your book, Jarrod, I apologize. I'm gonna rush right back to my office.
You haven't purchased my $80 book?
But I have a question about this sort of, you seem to set it up, at least in your initial discussion, within the context of democracy. So I'm wondering if there's something different about the process of securitization in democracies or in authoritarian regimes, because it seems like, I love the securitization literature, but it seems like so much of it is informed by looking at democratic processes through which acts become securitized, and it seems like there's different mechanisms for which that can occur in a democratic regime, just even the whole nature of what's allowed in Discourse and Speech Act would seem to vary greatly.
That's an absolutely fantastic question. So part of that gets at this issue of audience, right, which is something that securitization theory still struggles with. Who is the audience? There are often multiple audiences for securitizing moves. Who is the relevant audience for this, or who is the key audience or primary audience or whatever? So I address this a bit in the book. So democracies do differ from authoritarian or autocratic states in some important ways. In the first instance, securitizing moves with respect to major issues, and I should be clear that the book is not talking about everyday relations with democracy, between democracies, or between democracies and authoritarian states, but rather the context of major security/war type decisions. The securitizing move is made to a large group of people, right, the general electorate. And these people don't know each other. I don't know about you. You're very popular, so maybe you know most Americans. I don't know most Americans. In fact, I don't even know most of the people here at Georgia Tech. So we don't know most of each other. We don't know each other for the most part. And so we are bound together by what Benedict Anderson called our imagined national community, right? And that's an important element for democracy, right? Democratic securitizers have to rely much more on these imagined communities to make their securitizing moves, because they're not able to rely on personalistic connections or tribal clan type connections. And those kinds of personalistic connections can be more prevalent in autocratic or authoritarian regimes, not because the securitizing process is fundamentally different, but because the audience that the securitizing move is made to is often very much smaller. So you can imagine in China, the securitizing move might be made to the upper echelons of the party, right? Or you can imagine in an African state that's tribally based, you can imagine that the securitizing move is made with respect to specific muckety-mucks in the tribal structure. So because there are these smaller audiences, the securitizing move is very different, right? You can pull on material strings, right? Like, well, if we don't do this, you can imagine Vladimir Putin saying, well, if you don't follow along, your oligarchy gets, your privileged access in the oligarchic structure goes away, right? See Khodorkovsky, right? Or whatever, right? So there are these different strings that they can pull. Securitization still occurs, but the basis of securitization is very, very different. And that actually, sort of part of what I'm doing in this book is trying to break the democratic piece out of the democratic piece, which has been siloed. And in point of fact, democracies are some of the most powerful states in the system. They are a very common state in the system. And so actually the democratic piece is not its own thing, but part of a broader ecosystem of security. And if we think about it in a broader ecosystem of security, then we can think about this same issue of the political, social, and cultural context that empowers securitizing moves, both in democracies and in authoritarian states. And you can think about the ways in which, so China is a great example because there's an interesting hybrid between the ways in which the audience might be the upper echelons of the party, the Politburo. They have like 2 tiers of Politburo, right, John? They have like an inner and an outer or something like that?
Standing committee.
Standing committee, yeah. So there's the standing committee, and then there's the Politburo, the standing committee smaller. So you have this inner ring, but then there's Chinese political leaders clearly feel that there's a broader legitimacy that they have to engage with. So if you take a broader view of these factors, then you can sort of look at China in the same context that I would be looking at the United States, and using the same theoretical underpinnings, even if you don't come to this, even if the dynamics are very different.
Larry, I'm sorry. Larry, which of the Middle Eastern states would you say has more ideational capability, power? I mean, I think of several states that have devoted a lot of resources to that. The Islamic Republic of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and maybe Qatar.
Right.
Have they succeeded? Which are there other states? Which of the states have the greatest ideational ability in the Middle East? Secondly, what would you recommend to the democratic countries of Asia and North America and Europe to enhance their ideational capability in this contest?
Well, yeah. So, first question in terms of the who has the most power and is really, I think, dependent on when we're talking about, to some extent, basically a large extent, and what issue on certain issues that they could. And I think there might be an overall general, but there's some that certain countries can't really speak to very well, and others can. So. I mean, if we look, it's not really. If we look in terms of the 1950s and 60s, then it's hands down. It seems like Egypt is the leader in this regard. And
today, focused in today.
Right, but what I'm trying to give an example of is saying how it often shifts various periods of time, and I think in a lot of cases, as I said, not only just in shifts in terms of time, but also with in terms of areas in terms of leadership. And it's sometimes even in analyzing various small little periods, things can change, and we don't know in terms of overnight whether it works. today I think, like looking at basically at this week, it's really hard to say immediately at this period of time. I don't know. It's a question of really catching up with your breath. You can say in the 2000s there seemed to be this, at least what I would describe, and again, it depends on partly the audience and the issue, and it's really difficult because the other difficult thing about this, admittedly, is and a lot of the critics kind of claim about this, is how do you exactly measure this? Public opinion is extremely difficult, and then public opinion may not capture everything, but there is almost, in a sense, a general sense, and one of the ways of kind of getting around this is really looking at not so much as okay, how successful, how are they perceived to be threatening, and in what ways are states reacting to this type of threat? So in the 2000s, we can kind of see a train of, say, Iran. It was seen as being quite threatening to many of the states, and depending on which issues I mentioned. And then it seemed to be that that many people talked about Turkey, but the Turkey example is kind of interesting because, is what I also say in the book here, it's not really the projection in the same way that, say, Iran is much more aggressive rhetoric in various ways, and Turkey, you would think, in a sense, would be a bigger threat because you have an idea. Well, here's a successful country with democratic institutions, if not moving on its way there at least that period of time, with a, some might say, is very Islamist, very liberal Islamist government throughout the parts of the 2000s. It knows how to govern, and it's taking an active role, and it wants to see itself as a global player. So then you would say, okay, this is really an example. But what I would say is it wasn't really projecting power the same way, projecting this type of ideational power to the others, and so it wasn't seen as this type of threat. What I do see is actually in the 2000s, you see this type of, late 2000s, you see this type of shift, because in a certain sense it was interfering on various issues of say, spheres of influence of other major actors, things that really they could claim these types of ideational power areas or these type of influence. For instance, in Egypt, when it comes to the Palestinian issue, getting involved in that. Not just the aggressive rhetoric, say, of the mid-2000s, of the 2002 Davos conference when Erdogan attacked Israel, but later, as far as actually being physically involved, and that might have to do with the Mavi Marmara sponsoring this through, later became first denials, but also there have been links to the Turkish government. But it didn't just upset others, it upset, of course, the Egyptians, saying, what are you guys doing this? And they had to kind of really bite their lips when it came to the Turks being involved. So what I'm saying is these types of fluctuations, again, on certain issues, that kind of wax and wane over periods of time. Again, if the Iranians were to talk about their limit, certain actors also are limited when it comes to what issues they talk about, and they have to be very careful. The Iranians have to be extremely careful when I'm talking about Islam in general, in part because the easy comeback to that is saying, well, all the way it's easy to dismiss your Shia, and this is what a lot of the actors have done, and actually playing off a little bit of Jarrod's important work on securitization is one of the things I talk about is that I hope to develop further also in research is securitizing sectarianism, which is what's done. And it's not necessarily that term might be something new, but what it's been played out as, even in the early 1980s, is really saying, how do you undermine how do you make somebody a threat in this way, is bringing out the sectarian differences. And it might be sectarian, it might be ethnic, talking about Persians, really emphasizing this Persian aspect. Therefore, the ideas are really, they're really inauthentic, and they're not really part of our heritage or core. They're not close to our identity. This happens in the early 1980s, and you see this ramp up of rhetoric, especially in the 2000s. We talk about this idea of the Shia arc. This is precisely that, of how do you say, oh, the Shia are coming throughout this region, and and the states kind of push back with this by really emphasizing these ethnic and sectarian aspects.
What do democracies do?
Okay, so good. What would democracies do? One is, I guess one would be to emphasize whatever types of things that you can emphasize as commonalities with other. One of the important things is what is it that you have in common with those states? How are you effective? How do you talk to them? You have to find commonalities within, say, another culture that might be. It's impossible, say, for instance, for a state to project maybe a Buddhist type of ideational foreign power to a Muslim majority society. It would be difficult to draw on those symbols. So there's got to be some type of commonality that's really speak to them, and at the same time say something that would attract them in such a way that that would say, here's what the government or the local population is off. And that's partly what I would say is what I think is overlooked in a lot of these. People talk about ideas and a lot of times it's framed as this positive thing about positive things have changed, but not necessarily seeing, Jarrod's work does this too in this way, but also seeing of how they are threatening or how they've been manufactured basically as threats, how they can be threats in this way. And I think, again, it would really depend on, if I were this ideational power, ideological power consultant for these areas, how would I do it? I think it would really depend on the case, really crafting and being careful with the message and depending on what also you want to get across and what point.
We've hit the noon witching hour, but no one seems to be breaking down the door. So.
Jarrod, I wanted to pick up a point that I guess Jenna raised and you embellished. One of my problems with securitization is it really it doesn't look at the interaction between the parties. And I think you mentioned Russia. I think there's a really interesting thing going on right now. We securitize, what's going on there as this throwback to 19th century. Russia's not part of the club. It's an autocratic regime. But if you look at the way that they've securitized it, they've acted as if they're a democracy. The way they cast it is that, the fascists are at the door. This is, 1930s. This, that, and the other. And so what's really interesting is you have these two securitizations that are going on that are exactly, we discount them as a democracy and are creating this image, and they're very much acting like a democracy, whether or not we buy it in making their case, which may raise questions not so much about explaining intervention or why there is a conflict, but how do you get out? Okay, this presents a challenge for conflict resolution. The other thing I wanted to ask you in terms of your empirical research, I'm struck by the Nixon-Kissinger framing of India during that period, especially given what their grand strategy evolved into years later. So I'm just wondering if they began to adopt, and did you see their framing of India begin to change, or at least Kissinger's as he continued on? India becomes a different player in the triangular relationship as that begins to materialize.
So, with respect to your first comment, so this is part of the complexity of the audience, right? So, the Putin administration is not. So you can imagine that there are interlocking sort of securitizations, and part of what's going on is who's sort of framing of this issue is going to win out in sort of an international audience sense. And in that context, Putin's not doing a very good job, right? So, at least from the American standpoint, he's not doing a very good job. The Western Europeans seem to be on the American side of this thing rather than the Russian side of this thing. But what's also interesting to me is that this symbol of 1930s fascism is being used by both sides, right? So as I've heard the coverage, so I tend to listen to the BBC coverage in the morning, and more you hear the BBC mentioning 1938, right? And the fact that the Nazis used protection of minorities in other countries to justify their invasion of Czechoslovakia, and so you have both sides trying to use this same idea in service to their own securitizing moves, obviously against each other. I talk a little bit about conflict resolution or sort of diffusing. So if you understand security as the outcome of a securitizing move, that offers, I think, a little bit more hope than just sort of saying security is an objective state of affairs. And it is or it isn't, right? You have these zero-sum, non-overlapping Venn diagram situations. But you have to understand, you have to sort of try to get inside the heads of this, or you have to get inside the securitizing system as it's occurring in the other place if you really want to resolve the conflict.
But that's the puzzle, right, in this case. This is not a vital interest group. We can see a number of off-ramps. Yet we're not. It just keeps escalating.
Well,
and what's so interesting is that the Venn diagram, material interest, can't explain.
Yeah.
I mean, this
I agree.
We would just wash our hands of this.
I just wrote Ted Hopp about this last night. I said, there's a great paper to be written here. He said he had bigger fish to fry. But So yeah, I agree. This is where actually I think Larry's stuff comes in quite nicely, right? Because what's going on in Ukraine is, you're absolutely right. From a material standpoint, this is not a vital interest of the United States. We shouldn't actually, from a material standpoint, care that much at all. But from an ideational standpoint, and the idea of a threat to democracy or westernization or whatever, this is a deeply profound interest for the United States. So it makes sense in an ideational context. It doesn't make sense in a material. What was your second question?
No, about if you saw a shift in the frame.
Nixon, Kissinger. What's really interesting is then after 1971, Nixon and Kissinger, they were really beaten up over the deployment of the USS Enterprise. And then in 1974, when India tested its PNE, peaceful nuclear explosion, they said they did almost nothing, right? I don't know why they did almost nothing. You know, ostensibly, you have a new nuclear power on the block. They should have at least been slightly concerned if the spread of nuclear weapons is understood to be a security threat. And they didn't do much. I don't know if it's because they were chastened by what their experience in 1971 and the political cost they paid. I don't know if it's because of Watergate, which is occurring at the same time. Kissinger clearly takes a lead. Nixon's distracted. Nixon also has another foreign policy priority, which is that he's trying to resolve the conflict between Israel and Syria over the Golan Heights. That was going to be his legacy after the opening of China, obviously. Kissinger takes the lead on it. Kissinger's like, he's actually pushing, in 1971, he's pushing the Department of State apparatus to be aggressive on India, and in 1974 he's pushing on the Department of State apparatus to cool it with respect to India, right? So you have this really interesting reversal. That might have to do with their shift in their strategic outlook, but there could be other variables as well. It's difficult to say.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks very much for coming.
Thanks.
Intellectually stimulating discussion. Thank you, Scott.
Good job. I learned a lot. I look forward to reading your